Thank you everyone for joining us. I am Justina Block, and my company Osmia Bee is thrilled to be partnering with the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens and Pollination for our first of 7 live webinars. Our guest speakers today are Thane Maynard, Director of the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens and the home of Fiona, and Dr. Olivia Carroll, author of The Bees in Your Backyard, a guide to North America's bees. Thane and I are streaming from the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens live right now, and Olivia is at her home in New Mexico. Welcome, and thank you so much for being our guest for our first live webinar on the Pollinator Report. I'd like to see where any of our guests are joining us, where they're from. If you'd like to, in the chat room, let us know. Do we see? No? Gus? Oh, here we go. We have Olivia. Oh, Kristen. Oh,
Utah, West Virginia.
We have Dr. Teresa Pittsinger from the Bee Lab at Logan, Utah. Awesome. Thank you, Teresa. Do we see any? We have Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm looking here, Middletown, Ohio. Phil from Middletown. Daniel from Norwood, Ohio. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started with the wild bees of Cincinnati, learning about the tiny little bees that live in a big city. Thank you, Thane and Olivia, for being here today.
You bet. And thank you, Justina, so much for pulling this together, putting your energy into it, for Osmia Bee to sponsor it. It has a lot of great energy and it's a lot of fun. And Olivia, I'm honored to be on with you. I loved when you visited our zoo last year. I look forward to your next visit because I learned more about bees walking with you through the zoo for 20 minutes than I ever knew. Like many people, I could identify a honeybee and a bumblebee. But on our walk, you identified and even caught dozens of different types that most people wouldn't have even known were different types of bees. So that diversity and your understanding of it is really contagious.
You know, that was so fun for me, Thane, just because, you know, I talk to people a lot about bees, but be able to share them with you and see your passion and curiosity about these bees that are living with all of the wild animals that are there at the zoo was really neat. You in Ohio are fortunate to have over 500 different kinds of bees by our estimation, all living there and thriving even under your noses in cities. It doesn't have to be a wild landscape to see them. I thought I might start today by kind of introducing our native bees in case people think that the only important bees are the honeybees. And then you and I could maybe chat a little bit about what the zoo is doing to encourage people to create habitat for our very important and powerful pollinators in city environments. Does that sound all right?
That sounds great.
All right. So I want to make sure everyone's aware that when we talk about bees, we're not just talking about those honeybees and bumblebees that, you know, we see and recognize immediately as bees. We think that around the world, there's probably somewhere between 20 and 30,000 different kinds of bees, with somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 in the US and Canada together. And you're probably wondering why I don't have an exact answer on this for how many kinds there are. Well, isn't it 3,923. And the reason is that we're still finding new species quite commonly. I've done projects in a number of places out west that haven't been well collected prior to my efforts there. And we're finding, you know, upwards of several dozen new species per project. So there's still a lot of room for exploration and learning. And that's probably true even in places like Ohio. I know that new species have been found in the last 20 years or so in downtown New York City. So if they can be found there, they're probably species we don't know about in the Cincinnati area as well. We guess somewhere around 500 species in Ohio. And just to put that in perspective, we think that east of the Mississippi River, there's about 770 different kinds of bees. So Ohio has what, 5/7? You can do the math and help me out there, but quite a large proportion of all of the bees that occur in Eastern North America occur in Ohio and can be seen there. And if we compare that across the US, you can see that that compares pretty favorably to most of the states that we find in the East. And that probably has to do with the fact that you straddle a number of really interesting ecosystems as you move from north to south and east to west across the state. So let's get to know a couple of these bees. Most people, when they think of a bee, this is the one that comes to mind. Certainly a very important bee, Really important for agriculture, and we use it extensively, not just for pollinating our crops, but also for the tasty honey. This might be a little more representative. And so let's walk through a few of the myths that are associated with bees that come from thinking that all bees act like honeybees do. First is the fact that most people think that in order to see a bee, you should be looking for something that's about the size of a honeybee, that kind of, middle size of your little pinky finger there at the end. But bees, in fact, come in a lot of different sizes and shapes and colors. At the large end, we have the carpenter bees. This is one of our Western species, but you also are probably familiar with the Eastern carpenter bee out there. And I believe I saw some at the zoo when I was there last year. And then on the small end, we have these little bees. They're sometimes called small mining bees or fairy bees. Here's the smallest bee in North America, next to a quarter for scale, so you can see just how tiny they come. As you can imagine, with some of the tinier flowers that you find across North America, this is an adaptation to being able to fit into some of those small flowers. Most of these bees don't nest in hives. In fact, only the honeybee truly nests in a hive. The rest of them nest in the ground or maybe in some other pre-existing cavity. This is one of my personal favorite bees. This is a little tiny mallow bee, and she's digging out a nest in the middle of a road, a dirt road of all places. And you can see her using her forelegs and her mouth parts and her head and everything to kind of make the perfect little hole in the ground. And in that, it'll probably be anywhere from 6 inches to maybe 2 feet deep. In that nest, she'll make a series of tiny little nurseries, and each one of those nurseries will have pollen that she leaves for an egg that she lays. So let's go over what we just said there. One, unlike honeybees, they don't nest in hives. And two, unlike honeybees, there's no queen and workers that are dividing up the tasks of bee life. This mother right here is both the queen and the worker. She makes the nest and she also lays the eggs. This is something that you guys in Ohio should really keep your eyes out for, because you have a disproportionate number of bees that nest in wood compared to where I am out in New Mexico. More of our bees are ground nesters. So here's a cute little leaf cutter. She's bringing a rolled up piece of leaf back to her nest, which is going to be one of the holes that you can kind of see in this bit of log here. If you were to look inside, you would see that she's unloading a huge mass of pollen that she's storing on the underside of her belly. She did the little Michael Phelps flip there to flip over, and now she can shove all of that pollen off. And each of those little mounds of pollen that you see provides for one solitary little bee egg. And each of those bees is separated from its brothers and sisters by the little chewed up leaf walls that she has created in between there. When they don't use the chewed up pieces, they'll also sort of make these origami little like envelopes out of leaf pieces that they put in there. And each one of those little envelopes will contain a bee growing up to be an adult to emerge the next year. This is one of my favorite bees that we find in Ohio. It's a species of longhorned bee. I think it's called the two-spotted longhorned bees. And these are all males. You can tell by their long antenna. These definitely occur at the Cincinnati Zoo and in that area. And at night in your backyard, you might find a bachelor pad of male bees all sort of swarming together, grabbing onto a bit of leaf. And that's where they hang out till morning when they fly away and start the process over. The ones that don't nest on little pieces of grass stem will make themselves a little place to hang out for the evening inside a flower, and it's kind of fun to find the males curled up in these flowers like this. Many of these bees are specialists, so pollen is collected for the sole purpose of feeding the babies. So the mama bees, the mothers and the females, are the ones that are collecting pollen, and the pollen is taken back to the nest to provide for their offspring. It's not for them to eat. They may eat a tiny bit, but mostly it's to provide for their babies. And many of them are very picky mothers about what kind of pollen they feed to their offspring, and will only collect pollen from a few kinds of plants, even when there might be a lot that's available in an area. So we call these bees specialists. And when we're gardening for bees, when we're trying to prepare a landscape, it's important to keep in mind that you need to provide for both the generalists, the ones that'll eat just about anything, and the ones that are a little more specialist. And then I had to throw this in just because this is one of my favorite bees to watch, because they get so carried away inside the flowers, they kind of forget you're there. This is a squash bee in a squash flower, very common out in Ohio. And here she is. She's been foraging for nectar. You can see her tongue's out inside this plant. She's got pollen all over her face and her body. And now she's grooming all of that pollen off of her face, off her mouth parts, off her antenna, onto her forelegs, from her forelegs onto her mid legs, and from there onto her hind legs, where she has sort of grocery bags that she can put that pollen in and carry back to the nest. That's a male bee there that's attacking her, her. She doesn't seem too interested in the prospect of mating, but they will go off and repeat this process all morning long until the squash blossoms wilt. So one of the questions that people ask me quite often is how our native bees are doing. Are these guys going to be okay? There's a lot of stories in the news that maybe our bees are in decline. And the answer that I have to give is really that it's hard to say. We don't really know. As with any organism, and I'm sure, Thane, that you could speak to this with other wild animals all around the world, there are some that are winners and are going to be just fine, and there are some that maybe aren't going to do so well. And it's up to us scientists to try and gather the data that we need in order to determine who the winners and losers might be, so that we can direct our efforts to really help the ones that most need our help. So each of these bees has a very different life history. Some are spring bees, some have a summer season, some are fall bees, some nest in the ground, some nest in pre-existing cavities like the carpenter bees, the leafcutter bees, things like that. And it's worth understanding these stories in order to know how best to help them. And it's really fun to learn about them. They're just such fascinating creatures. It can be really fun to learn what it's going to take to help our bees. So some of the things that we can keep in mind, and this is kind of common sense, even if we don't have the data that we need to really say how much of a decline is happening, anytime we remove habitat for our ground nesting bees, anytime we pave an area, we may have removed some of the habitat where they could live. Non-bee friendly gardening techniques, putting in plants that aren't really good for our native bees, can be something to keep in mind. Monocultures of one kind of plant that bloom all at once and then go away maybe aren't so good. And we're still trying to get a handle on how exactly insect and pesticides could be harming our bees and how cautious we should be when we apply them. And finally, out where I am, especially this is true, it could be that those honeybees that we rely on so much for agricultural reasons may in some cases outcompete the native bees that have been on the landscape for a lot longer than the honeybees have been here. But data suggests, and this is kind of amazing, that bees will persist anywhere with just the slightest nudge, just a little bit of help from us. Data shows over and over and over again that bees can persist in urban areas with just a little bit of help from us, providing the right kind of resources for them. All they need is some healthy food and a place to live. And I think that's something that's within the realm of possibility for us to provide for, especially when we have resources available to help us understand how best to do this. This is my mom's yard, and this is in downtown Salt Lake City. It's surrounded by this monoculture of grass and pavement. There isn't a wild area anywhere to be seen near here, but she put in this beautiful xeriscaped garden, and within 1 year had specialist bees visiting the flowers that she had put in there. So bees are able to find these wonderful resources with just a little bit of help from us. I had the opportunity, and Thane, I remember this as fondly as you do, to come out to the Cincinnati Zoo last year and show some people some of the bees that exist right there in the zoo, you know, this area that's known for Fiona and the cute baby rhino that I'm so in love with right now. But there are also all of these wild bees persisting in the same place, and it was really fun to get to share that with you and show you some of the bees that we found. And if you don't mind, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that I can hold up this box. These are the specimens that we found here, all pinned up from our little stay out there. I'm still figuring out what all species we have, but I do know that we had close to a dozen different genera just on that 1 day of collecting out there. So that hints to me that there's probably a lot of diversity there, but also in the landscapes around the zoo, you're probably connected in terms of habitat to a lot of other places.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious to know from you, if you could tell me, what was it that got the zoo interested in learning about pollinators?
Well, you know, we live in an exciting time. on the one hand, Olivia, everybody knows when you read the headlines and you read about the loss of nature all the way to climate change, sometimes people are disheartened. And so always the question is, well, what can people do? And our zoo is an accredited botanical garden as well. Our official title is Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. And we have a great big horticulture program, also a plant conservation and plant research division. But our great strength is reaching the general public. When you look at the zoo strategic plan, our key objective is to inspire every visitor with wildlife every day. And of course, the old saying in the zoo business is that large mammals pay the bills. And that's like baby Fiona. People want to come see her or see our cheetahs run full blast. But where people really experience animals is where they live. And so it ends up being a great combination of coming to the zoo and being inspired, but recognizing what can we do. I was inspired when I saw that picture of your mom's front yard, because that's a great looking natural yard. At our house, my wife and I are pretty new to doing native gardening. We've only done it the last few years, and we're slowly growing. But I can say this as a newbie, it really is inspiring, because you can put, whether it's a native milkweed that eventually will attract monarch butterflies, and then eventually they'll lay eggs and become caterpillars and chrysalis and fly away, or they'll start to attract the many different kinds of pollinators that you've talked about, different species of bees, et cetera. And this isn't something you see slowly. I mean, you can put plants in the ground, and if you're paying a lick of attention, especially if you take a sweep net as you did and sort of take a look at what's out there, there are dozens of species that you never even knew existed before that are right outside your front door. So it's exciting that people can get involved hands-on. And it's also a neat network. Certainly zoos aren't the only groups doing this. Garden clubs, nature centers, all the park districts. Many states have done some terrific work where they plant native plants along the midway of highways or along the edge of highways. So instead of mowing it every time, they may only mow it once a year and let the rest grow up in a meadow. And again, promoting native plants and those native pollinators. It's a neat thing that's catching on. And the more people can understand that we aren't just protecting nature to save tigers or even to save native bees, those natural systems also support people. So it's a great connection and sort of a front door to conservation. Now, I saw some questions come through, and one naturally was about stinging. And one of the people on the Q&A said, okay, there are thousands of species of bees. How many of those sting people?
That's a great question. It's what I get a lot. So only female bees are capable of stinging. Only the female bee possesses this modified ovipositor that can be used to defend herself. In my experience, and I have handled several 100,000 bees, I find that as long as I don't squish them, they don't tend to sting me, and they'll land on your hands and sort of explore and crawl around, and you can hold a bee without too much difficulty a good majority of the time. One of my favorite tricks to do when I'm encouraging people to learn and know about bees and not be afraid of them is to find male bees, which you can often recognize by the coloring on their face or the length of their antenna, and hold one in my hand and share it with someone so that they too can hold that. And I find that that's a great way to take a wild animal and make it something that you're in a way petting. Can be fun.
That's a great idea, because it is true that animals are inspiring to people. And the neat thing about what you're doing and this idea of native pollinators in our own yards is helping everybody be good at looking what's around us. You mentioned, for instance, that great footage you had of the bee that was digging into a dirt road. Well, I've probably walked down dirt roads where they're building nests and never had enough sense to pay attention. And it's fun to think there's so much out there.
And once you start noticing one thing, then you start noticing the other things. Oh, wait, there's butterflies here and wasps here. And what's that bird in the tree? And the whole world kind of comes to life when you start paying attention to any one thing, can sort of lead to all of the others. And I think that it ends up being, we're providing this habitat and maybe helping out our bees, but at the same time, it's very rewarding. It's a win-win situation for the people that are planting, in your case, just a small piece of your garden with native plants, and also the bees that are there. It's hard to go wrong.
That's right. Now, I know we also had questions about bee lookalikes. Everybody's familiar, for instance, say with yellow jackets, which are common here.
Right.
And are those bees or wasps, or how's all that shake out?
Yeah, how does that shake out? So if you want to be very technical about it, it turns out that in terms of the way the common ancestor that's shared by all of these creatures, bees are a kind of wasp. Strange but true. The difference is that in this case, bees are the wasps that have evolved to collect pollen and live off of flowers instead of eat meat, whereas the wasps are the meat eaters. And in fact, I had a yellow jacket just last weekend. We had wonderful pulled pork sandwiches in our backyard, and I watched a wasp come down and land on my daughter's plate and grab a little shred of pork and haul it away. And I was like, yep, that's it. The wasps are the meat eaters. And that's really the big difference. But if you spend enough time looking at them, you can start to see some of the differences in the way that they look based on these dietary preferences that they have.
Now, I know with larger animals, a lot of times the way they look, perhaps their pattern or the shape of their ear tufts, is often thought to be a way to attract a mate. And the bees, for instance, when you showed photos and videos of, were very attractive. Some had striped abdomens, much like your striped shirt, and others had different patterns. Is that also to look for a mate?
I don't think we know a whole lot about that. We know a little more about wasps, especially the social wasps. It appears that some of those colorings that you see on their faces are actually like name tags, and they can tell the difference between individuals based on the markings on the face. And
Wow.
researchers have gone in and repainted the face and like changed the name of a wasp in there. But as far as our solitary bees, we do know that some of the features that we find on them, some of the tufts of hair on the legs or the length of the antenna or stuff, is probably related to mating. But the real specifics of how that works and what they're trying to communicate is still lost on us as researchers. So much still to learn, so much to learn. And can I jump in here and add, that's kind of, I think, a great segue into something that I wanted to bring up, which is that when I started as a bee researcher some 20 years ago, I was by myself. It was just me. There were no cell phones yet, or if they were, they were too expensive for me to have one. And we were limited in terms of what we could know about bees to what scientists could determine. And if there's only a dozen of us out there studying these things, and there's only 24 pairs, total eyes looking at the bee world. Now we have a whole network. How many people are on here? 180 participants today alone who are interested in bees or interested in pollinators, and most of them have phones and can go out and record. We now have this way to learn a lot more about things, even like how male and female bees interact with each other just in people's backyards, and we can learn a lot more than we ever used to. So I put in a plug for citizen science as one of the added benefits to having bees in your yard, because if you can share that on iNaturalist or with the Cincinnati Zoo or some of these other places, it can be very beneficial to science.
Those are good points. And certainly I've had great luck with iNaturalist. That's a fun way to learn things you've not been able to identify before, and an emerging resource, no doubt about it. I think what you said before is one of the key points, that once you start to look at things and start to have an understanding of how nature works, it relates to how it works on a global system, not just in your backyard. And that can be our own impact, whether that's our diet or the resources we use to learn not to waste. Or as you'd said about pesticides, maybe say a little bit more on that, because gosh, there was a day this country sprayed pesticides recklessly, and it's better, but it probably needs to get better still.
And this is a big deal, out where you are, especially because there's so much more of the agriculture that relies on that than there is here in New Mexico, where you can't grow anything because it's a desert. But I would say that there is so much we don't yet know about how, like, quantifying the amount of pesticide and how much that impacts bees, like how many bees are lost, what's the lethal dose, and all of that for all of these different species. When you think about like a leaf cutter bee, which is literally snipping pieces of leaves off of a plant, versus a bee that doesn't really have anything to do with them, you can imagine how these pesticides, insecticides, even herbicides might affect our different bees in different ways. So with that said, I like to tell people to err on the side of caution. I understand the reason. I have a vegetable garden too, and it's hard to watch some of these things get eaten. So I understand the need there, but anytime we can refrain and resist and try and purchase things that don't have those pesticides sprayed on them before we even buy the plant, we're probably doing a good service for the beneficial insects that we have in our yards.
I think everybody is coming to understand that when you see headlines that talk about relatively common pesticides have now been tested enough to know that they can cause cancer in humans. And that means that's an extreme dose. So there's clearly too many chemicals in the atmosphere sometimes being used in an unregulated way. The more you can be cautious, the more you can eat organic, all those things make more sense. And the more you can have an understanding of how nature works. Organic farmers are fascinating to talk to about this because they have a pretty good understanding of how to work with insects and pests rather than work against them.
That balancing act that they pull off is really something. It truly is. That's pretty neat. I see a whole bunch of questions here. Should we see if there are any that we could answer?
Sure.
If a bee is flying around me, how do I know if it will try to sting me? Wait and see. Generally speaking, a bee that's flying around you is probably more curious about the colors of clothes that you're wearing, or perhaps you're somewhere near its nest entrance. But in my experience, bees flying around me doesn't necessarily mean that it's trying to sting me. It's a lot of effort on the part of a bee to go to the trouble. So unless you're right near a nest where perhaps it sees you as a threat, I would say that's not really something that you have to worry about too terribly much. Where do these bees keep the nectar for their babies? So bees, it depends on the bee species, and some bees will use a lot of pollen with just a touch of nectar added, which they'll store in their crop and bring back. Or in the case of some bees, they'll actually turn the pollen and nectar into a bit of a mud that they put onto their back legs and kind of carry home as sort of a Play-Doh-y muddy mass. So there's two ways to get it back. One is on the legs mixed with pollen, and one is stored internally and then regurgitated when they get home. Boy, lots of questions here.
Olivia, somebody asked a question about all these signs you see in neighborhoods that say they spray for mosquitoes. And the ads sound good, like, oh gosh, take back your backyard, but that must be a lot of spray to get rid of mosquitoes. It can't be good for other animals like bees.
Yeah, and I wonder, I don't know what specific ones are used out there, but some of them target specifically the water sources. So I would expect that those might be more detrimental to the honeybees, which rely more on those water sources than some of our native bees, which seem to persist fairly well on whatever natural sources of water are there. Just in the nectar that they're drinking. But definitely something to keep in mind, especially if your neighbors happen to have hives and stuff that you could be, the mosquito spraying could potentially be impacting those bees. What are your findings on the role of native bees in pollinating crops? How many crops are truly reliant on the Western honeybee, and how many would do just fine with native pollinators? So the reason that we often use the honeybee in order to pollinate some of our crops is because we want to maximize seed set. So the goal is to make as many apples as possible to get them to market in order to recoup whatever costs it was to put in those apples. And so for that reason, we often supplement whatever native pollinators are there and would totally do the job, but maybe we would have slightly less than if every single flower on a tree were pollinated. So the honeybees, by putting in 30,000 bees in a hive, in one hive together, we can maximize the number of apples that are produced there. That being said, we're finding more and more that there are limitations to how good a honeybee can be. And when we supplement or provide, when we provide native habitat around an agricultural crop that has honeybees in it, you get even more seed set. So it seems that they can in some ways complement each other in those agricultural settings. Very different from what we find in natural settings where the honeybees seem to just sort of take over, but they do complement well in many agricultural settings. Thane, can you tell people about this pollinator challenge that you guys have going on, and how people could, if they are interested in creating a yard like yours that has even just a small garden as a start, how they could do that using the zoo?
Absolutely. A fun program that we began in 2019 was to have people plant native plants in a pollinator garden and then celebrate that and register it with Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. And it can be certified as a pollinator native garden. And we started out now about a year and a half ago and said, well, we'll have a goal of 500, maybe 500 people will do this. And we thought it might just happen locally. Well, within the first year, we had over 1,000 registered pollinator gardens. that number has continued to grow, and now it's headed up toward 2,000. And it's not just here. We've had people that have heard about it through social media and the zoo, and they are in Florida and New Jersey and a wide variety of places doing that same thing. And you end up with a really tricky little sign. You put it in your yard, and it's cute and small, but it can show your neighbors as they're walking by or walking their dog that, gosh, I care about native wildlife and that this is a thing. And what's fun is in your neighborhood, then you start to talk to people. And I've seen this happen in our own yard. I think our neighbors go from thinking, what are they doing? And are they growing weeds? And why so much milkweed, et cetera, into instead saying, oh gosh, well, that makes a lot of sense. And as I said before, if you stop and look, especially on a late summer day, the number of pollinators, and the flashy ones are, of course, goldfinches and monarch butterflies, et cetera, but there are pollinators all over these native plants. And it's just a joy to see. And it happens literally overnight. It's always been amazing to me. And I know, Olivia, you know the real details on this, but you can take a plant that hasn't been planted around here for a while, put that in the ground, and a species that's dependent on that plant somehow or another finds it. I have no idea how. And I've seen that many times, whether it's with yucca moths or it's with, in the case of butterflies and milkweed. It just really does happen overnight, and it's fun. So if folks want to, they can check the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens website, which is cincinnatizoo.org. The information's right there. You can register your garden for free, and it'll be fun. Then you'll be part of what we call pollination, and a great way to learn more about it and how to be involved in this very topic.
Excellent. Do you have any references there or places people can go to find out about what native plants to plant in your area?
We do indeed. Yeah, we have a great big horticulture department here at the Botanical Garden, and they've been involved in this for a long, long time. So we have, in essence, basically online brochures of what are pollinators and native pollinators that really thrive in our region, and lots of references how you can learn about it even in other regions. Our zoo has a long history, Olivia, with insects. In 1978, we opened our insectarium, which now has 109 living species of invertebrates. But at the time, it was the world's very first major insectarium. And when we were working on it, a lot of people said, what are you doing? Don't you need to improve the ape house or the cat house? But our director at the time really embraced biodiversity. And his point was, and probably quoting E.O. Wilson, that the world is run by small organisms, that big mammals are important, say whales and bears, but the truth is most ecosystems don't depend on large mammals, but they do depend on pollinators, they depend on invertebrates to recycle nutrients. And so teaching people about insects and other invertebrates is a big part of our zoo, and a fun way that people can get directly involved. Another neat thing is zoos are largely for families and kids. And as we all know, kids love bugs, they love invertebrates, they love small things they can observe in their own yard.
Absolutely. Absolutely, they do. My own kids are no exception. Absolutely. I see a question here. Someone asked, can bees smell? And that ties into the question of how bees are finding these plants, how specialist bees might be finding plants that are put in a yard that hasn't seen any of that kind of plant in a while. And bees do smell. Bees can smell from great distances away. It depends a little on the species, but they seem able to find scents from maybe even up to a mile away. Those little odor molecules traveling in the air, bees can pick up on them. And the way that they do this isn't with a nose like you and I have, but through their antenna. Their antenna have all these little receptors on them, just like little antenna on the antenna that can pick up those little molecules and help the bees to find their flowers. So yes, bees can smell a lot more things than my own nose can, actually. Is the sting of the bee the last act of their life? In the case of the honeybee, yes, that is the truth. But in all of these other native bees, they can actually, I speak from experience, sting you multiple times if they so desire without losing the sting because it's not barbed. And that there's an evolutionary reason why that makes sense. And it's because these native bees aren't part of a hive. And if she were to die in the process of stinging you, that would be the end of her and her progeny from then on. So because they're not working towards more of a collective organism, it doesn't make sense for them to lose their sting when they sting you. I saw, let's see, somewhere up here, Teresa said something that I thought was important to bring up. Let me see. Hold on one sec. It's here. I just saw it. There it is. Sometimes we forget that our use of herbicides take out flowers that bees would use in less manicured spaces. And this is true. And it's actually something that sometimes is used. So honeybees are not one of those specialist bees that we talked about. They're actually generalists, and they will visit anything, including invasive plants. So they can help proliferate some of these plants that we maybe don't want around. But because of their habit of doing that, sometimes people who have an apple, cherry, almond orchard may spray underneath to remove some of the flowers that the honeybees would be tempted to visit instead of the crop, which is maybe makes sense while the crop is being pollinated, but afterwards means that you've kind of turned that place into a bit of a flower desert. There's not much left for anybody after those honeybees are done there. So thanks, Teresa. That's a really good point to remember as one of the problems. Let's see, are there any other, let's see. Ground tunneling bees, is applying mulch or compost? Great question. Is applying mulch or compost to garden beds detrimental to them for tunneling? So there's a couple different papers that have kind of approached this and looked at it. And it appears that as long as the mulch itself isn't too thick, bees seem to be able to sort of maneuver around it. I'm not sure they prefer that, but they will work with it. Even gravel, bees will dig through gravel and get down to wherever they want to nest and whatever's underneath. If the mulch is too thick, or it's that kind of dyed, Thane, you might have seen that red, weird composty, barky stuff that's dyed that red color. That seems to be pretty hard for the bees to handle. And along those same lines, weed barrier, when you put in weed barrier, you kind of create a wall for bees that they can't quite get through to get down to where they would prefer to nest. So yes, both a great question and important things to think about when you're preparing. And Thane, you mentioned this as well, but just to make sure it's really clear, if it seems overwhelming to turn your entire front yard into this beautiful garden for bees, a flower pot on your front porch can do just as much as anything else. Put some natives on your front porch in a pot. And what you're doing is providing, you're creating a connected habitat. So you could be connecting Thane's yard to another neighbor's with just your little bit of plant material there that is attractive to bees. So it doesn't have to be big. What we're going for is connecting all of the habitats among us all.
Yeah, I would just say it's much easier than some people might imagine. They might imagine, oh my gosh, it's just this huge effort, or it's going to be really expensive, or it's going to be really hard. And we have found that that's not the case. You can start small, you can start with a few plants. And the truth is, these are native, and once they're in the ground, they don't take much care. And so it's really not a real expensive operation whatsoever. Nothing like putting in a whole new landscape through a landscaping corporation. And your satisfaction per dollar is extremely high, I'd say that. For instance, anybody who's ever put out bird feeders, and whether that's thistle seeds or hummingbird feeders, it takes a little bit of effort, but it's a lot of fun to see. This doesn't take any more effort or any more expense, and it's got a much longer life because when you plant, they're coming back next spring. It's really fun, and in fact, it grows bigger and bigger on its own.
That's right. This last question we'll probably get to today before you have to go. Jenny here is asking, what are some key plants for native bees? Can you list off just like 3 that seem to be really easy to grow and successful in your area?
Well, as I mentioned a number of times, milkweed's a big hit. I know there's a tremendous amount of interest here in the Midwest for the monarch butterfly flyway. And so there is an effort to try to encourage people to plant native milkweed. That can be swamp milkweed. There's some other species you can get. And again, make sure you get them from a place that doesn't use pesticides. A lot of times big box stores will sell plants, even native plants. But if you really start to ask, a lot of those might have come from an area where they use a lot of pesticides in the rearing of it. And that can have its own problem for insects. But you'll start to learn to ask around, and you'll know which suppliers really get what, and you'll ask which ones work well. Beyond that, I think the flowers that when you go and you choose, there's a beautiful tall yellow type of native sunflower that's just tremendous. They're still blooming here at the very last week of October, and sometimes they're 8 feet tall. And you'll see them in local parks where they really tried to grow meadows. And we have them here at the zoo, and people can also have those in their yard, and they're fun to see. There are also native species that are familiar in appearance to things that people have always loved, like black-eyed Susans and others. And yet you can get native species that's a win-win for you and the animals.
Right. That's great. And I remember at the zoo, you had a huge patch of a mint, and I don't know my Ohio plants well enough, but mint seems to be one that will proliferate all by itself, and you don't have to do much if you have a section, and it provides a lot of nectar, especially. So bees tend to really like that. And then there was one, let's see if I can remember, pie wheat, Joe.
Oh
pie
yeah,
wheat.
pie Joe weed. Yep.
Another great one for
You
bees.
hit on a good point when you described your mom's yard in Utah, which is a xeriscape, and meaning it doesn't need much help. You don't have to water it and fertilize it. Once you get that thing planted and going, it'll go, and it'll go every year after year. And that is, of course, really charming to almost anyone. Depending on your yard, it might need some weeding periodically, but that whole process is fun.
Yeah, anything that can self-proliferate like that, and you can stand back with your cup of coffee and just watch it happen. It's perfect. Well, I know you don't have a whole lot of time today, the busy life of a zoo director. So we won't
been incredibly fun.
Yeah, I know. I love this so much. I wish we could do it all the time. I will say this real quick. In addition to all of the things that can be planted to really help encourage bees and providing the nesting habitat and, you know, the mulching and all of that we talked about a little bit, learning about the bees and knowing what bees you have is another great way. Check out the Bees in Your Backyard website. We post fairly frequently about bees around the US and provide information on them if you're interested in learning. In addition, I know that the Cincinnati Zoo, let's see, I was told by Ron Wilson to call it the Cincinnati Botanical Garden and Zoo.
Right.
So there you go. You guys have another webinar coming up, I believe, November 20 with, do you remember who's on
We do,
that?
with Dominique Gonçalves, who's a wonderful young woman who works in Mozambique. She's Mozambican by birth, leads a big role in their conservation there through Gorongosa National Park, which has gone through an absolute rebirth over the last 10 years. And even there, they have a pollinator program. They work closely with native villages, native people, and to their benefit, work with pollinators. And her work also involves elephants. And believe it or not, the pollinators and the bees also relate to the elephants. So it'll be a fun discussion. Anybody interested in that sort of thing should tune in. She's absolutely a lovely young woman. And we've been lucky to have her here in Cincinnati. And no kidding, Olivia, when the COVID's over and people are traveling, we want to have you back here to the Botanical Garden to teach us more about bees and give a talk. And I know you mentioned your website, but I'll also pitch your book, Bees in Your Backyard. That's a great resource for people of any age who want to learn more about native bees.
Thanks so much, Thane. And I'll also be giving a webinar with Osmia Bee and Justina Block, and she's got a whole webinar series planned. If you want to learn about bees around the world, we're going to celebrate bee diversity on December 5th at 9 a.m. So go to osmiabee.com and you can check that out to see. And then I think the Cincinnati Zoo website will have the information for Dominique's talk coming up, which I really hope to come to as well. And Thane, I really look forward to when we get to be together again. And actually, I
agree.
Send you this box full of bees with their little labels. And
that's right. You'll fill them up.
Yeah, I will. We'll do some more of that. That was great. For any of the questions that are on here that we didn't get to, we will be filling out the answers to those, and those will be posted also for people. I know this is being recorded and will be available to all of the people that are here, as well as the ones that registered but were unable to make it in the end today. So with that, Thane, I'll say thank you so very much for your time.
Yeah.
Great to see you, even if it is from a distance.
That's right. Well, thanks to Olivia Carroll. Thanks to Justina Block. Thanks to Paris Sheik, who's helping us on the technical side. Thanks, everybody. Thank Christina Anderson from our office. She's our pollinator goddess at the Botanical Garden. It was fun to participate in this.
Thank you so much, Thane and Olivia, for being here. There are a few people I'd like to thank, though, that made this possible and contributed to this webinar. Of course, you just mentioned Christina Anderson, who's amazing, your executive assistant to you. And she's the coordinator of the Plant for Pollinator Challenge. So a huge thank you for her creativity and helping and making this webinar happen. It was a huge help. So go out there and visit the Cincinnati Zoo plantforpollinatorchallenge.com and register your gardens today. Hopefully we'll see you little pings on a map that once they're registered, you'll actually have a ping there. And so thank you, Christina, for everything, her energy and her love for pollinators and gardens is infectious. She's an amazing person. And I'd also like to thank their support for advertising our program, and many thanks to Brett Gilmore, the owner of Wild Beads Unlimited in Cincinnati, the Brown County Beekeepers Association, and In the Garden with Ron Wilson, the 55 KRC. Thank you so much. And also I like to thank this webinar would not be possible without the expertise and hours of hard work by Farah Sheikh and graphic designer and social media expert, Hannah Michaels. And so I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart, Thane and Olivia, for being here. It was fantastic. Thank you so much. We're learning so much. And thank you to the audience for participating and sharing their afternoon with us.
We'll see you next time.
That's right. We'll do it again.
Thank you. And what do you say, Thane? Keep it native? Or
That's right. Yeah, keep it native.
Thank you. Take care. Be well.